Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. We're in the midst of reviewing and refuting a book by Mr. Lance Conley, who is a former preterist and who's written this book, Hope Resurrected, with the claim that it's the be-all, do-all, answer-all, and final word against the full preterist view. The reality is this book virtually answers nothing about full preterism, what is better described as covenant eschatology. The book is rife with bad logic, false hermeneutic, basic presuppositions that are just flawed in the extreme. Now, in last week's video, I pointed out that Mr. Conley made the claim that the earliest of the church writers never addressed the problem of time. They never addressed the question of why the Lord had not come. Well, that's just blatantly false. As I pointed out in that video, please go back and watch that. There was a crisis of faith. That's what some scholars call it, by the way. There was a crisis of faith among the Jews who looked back at the destruction, realized that the kingdom and the Messiah should have come then, and lamented the fact, and even went so far as to say, well, the appointed time for the Messiah has come and gone. He has not come. Therefore, we just have to wait a whole lot longer. There was a crisis of faith among the earliest Christians. Barnabas, Hermas, the shepherd of Hermas, as I pointed out to you, in which there was a struggle. Why didn't the Lord come when he said he was going to come? Had he already come? Why would he even ask the question? Why would he even ask the question if the Lord had already come? If he knew that the day of the Lord was a time-ending, earth-burning event? Why would he ask that question? You see, he knew when it was supposed to be. He knew the time was back there. He pondered why it hadn't happened as he thought it was supposed to happen. So once again, Mr. Conley's claim that the earliest of writers did not struggle with this issue of time is simply false. Now, we continue. On page 71, oh, and by the way, Mr. Conley chides me for not paying attention to the earlier chapter in which he talks about the history of preterism. And no, I didn't pay attention to that because it's not relevant to whether or not it's true. The only thing that matters is, does the Bible predict that the coming of the Lord, the judgment, and the resurrection was to be in the first century? The unequivocal answer to that is, yes, the Bible teaches that. The Old Testament teaches that. The New Testament teaches that. So I don't have to spend my time examining and looking at all of Mr. Conley's attempts to poison the well against the preterist view by his claim, oh, preterism was unknown until the 18th, 19th century or whatever it was he said. Okay? That's why I didn't pay attention to that chapter, because it's irrelevant to the issue of whether or not the Bible teaches that the end was to be in the first century. It's irrelevant. Now, on page 71, Mr. Conley makes the following comment. When it comes to Greek terms, we can certainly use the words to mean what they usually mean. Now, you have to catch the power of that. Time words can mean exactly what they indicate sometimes. However, when one gets into apocalyptic language and eschatological in general, that's a major grammatical error. It should be, and eschatology in general. That's a confusing statement. Time can most definitely be on a whole different perspective with it. That's very confusing. It's just poorly written. Time statements in the Bible are always the hardest to talk on, but one needs to understand that when the terms used involve eschatological matters, time is not the same as it would be if you and I were talking in regular speech. Soon could be God talking to the prophet and the prophet dictating the prophecy as if it will happen tomorrow, but then it happens 1,000 years later. Now, I've got to tell you what, folks, this is one That single paragraph could take up 2, 3, 4 videos. It is absolutely chock full, not only of grammatical errors, but it's absolutely chock full of theological error. Now, you have to understand this. Please catch the power of this. All non-preterists know. All former preterists know and realize that if even one, listen to me carefully, they know, they understand, they comprehend that if even one New Testament statement about the coming of the Lord, the judgment, the resurrection, the end of the age, was said to be objectively, realistically, truly at hand 2,000 years ago, their entire case against preterism melts away and runs off into the dirt. It means that if even one time statement of seeming imminence of the coming of the Lord, judgment, resurrection, written 2,000 years ago, if even one of them is true, this entire book is completely and totally false. It's that simple. It's that powerful. Now, here's what that means. Doug Wilkinson wrote a book entitled Preterist Time Statements. Excellent book. I carry the book. You can order a copy from me. And Doug Wilkinson has documented that there are well over, if I remember correctly, 120 time statements in the New Testament indicating the nearness of the end. These things must shortly come to pass. The time is at hand. In a very, very little while, the Lord is standing right at the door. The parousia has drawn near. On and on and on it goes. Do you realize, folks, that the non-preterists must destroy, mitigate, or ignore an entire vocabulary of words in order to negate the full preterist position? Let that soak in. Or they must make the comment, just like Mr. Conley does here. They must say, well, when talking about regular, mundane things, yeah, at hand means at hand. Quickly, shortly, soon. Yeah. Those always mean imminence. Oh, but not when it comes to prophecy. Now, I want you to notice, it's fascinating what he does. He says, when one gets into apocalyptic language and eschatological in general, meaning eschatology in general, time can most definitely be on a whole different perspective with it. No, it cannot. Mr. Conley has it completely backwards. Because you see, in the rest of the book, he's going to try to convince the reader that the coming of the Lord on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, the sun, the moon, the stars being darkened and fall from the sky, etc., heaven and earth passing away. Now that, listen to me, even though it's apocalyptic language, must be taken literally, physically, of a literal, physical, bodily coming of Jesus as a 5'5" Jewish man riding a cumulus cloud out of heaven at the end of time and the destruction of literal, physical heaven and earth. Even though that's apocalyptic language, Mr. Conley says we have to take that language literally. Oh, but wait. When we're dealing with that apocalyptic language, which has to be taken literally, the time words related to that literalistic interpretation are all of a sudden figurative, metaphoric, meaning, in Mr. Conley's view, meaningless. He says, when we come to the time statements in regard to prophecy, we have to understand God is talking to the prophet. And The prophet is dictating the prophecy as if it will happen tomorrow. Catch the power of that. He understands that the language. He understands that the prophetic language, if taken at face value, sounds like it would happen soon. Oh, but we can't allow that. Because if we allow the language to stand, then the entirety of Mr. Conley's book goes down hard, never to be resurrected. So once again, what we have is Mr. Conley saying, apocalyptic language of the passing of heaven and earth, apocalyptic language of the Lord coming on the clouds with power and great glory, with the angels, with the shout in flaming fire. That's all literal, even though it's apocalyptic language. But the language telling us when it would happen is metaphoric. It's meaningless. Mr. Conley has completely flipped the reality. Now, I want to urge you to be viewing my videos on the Olivet Discourse as I am currently discussing Matthew 24, 29 to 31, where Jesus said, immediately after the tribulation of those days, and remember, the tribulation of those days is the days of the abomination of desolation, which Jesus said his apostles would see. And it's the abomination of desolation that when they, his apostles, saw it, they were to flee Jerusalem. They were supposed to go to the hills. Not some future generation 2,000 years away. Not some unknown, ambiguous generation that has been elasticized, plasticized into absolute meaninglessness. Again, Mr. Conley tells us, well, apocalyptic language means time statements are figurative. Well, if apocalyptic, or if time statements related to apocalyptic are figurative, then the language of the coming on the clouds with power and great glory is likewise figurative. It is such an unbelievably inconsistent and false hermeneutic to say that time statements mean nothing. And yet, this Hebraic, apocalyptic, hyperbolic, and metaphoric language of the coming of the Lord on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, that must be taken absolutely literally. Now look, I offered last week. I want to repeat the offer. In my book, Can God Tell Time? Been through about 4 or 5 different printings. Tens of thousands of copies have been sold. I examine the time statements of the Bible, and including Mr. Conley's objections, which we'll get more into, and I answer them with Scripture. In addition, in my book, Who is This Babylon?, I have a very special study on the time statements, not only of Revelation, but of the Bible, once again proving. When I wrote the book, I answered every major objection to the objective nature of time statements that I had heard up to that point. I must confess, Sam Frost has come up with a couple of brand spanking new ones since then. I mean, literally, virtually, well, maybe not 100%, but, they border on brand spanking new. And they are specious in the extreme. So, if you want 2 in-depth examinations of the time statements of Scripture, how they apply, regular price, $19.95 plus $4.95 shipping, $2.95 plus $4.95 shipping, your total delivered price, okay, certainly for the month of January 2020, U.S. orders only, $19.95 delivered to your door. Go to my website. Order the book, okay, order Who is This Babylon? Be sure to send me a note that says, hey, Don, I saw your offer for Babylon and Can God Tell Time at the special price. I will refund your shipping. Hey, thanks so much for joining me for this morning's morning musings. You have a safe weekend, okay? I'll see you on Monday.